Greetings, welcome to the show. This is the overview, and I'm your host, Brother Mbogo. Today I'm going to take a look at the BRICS grouping again. I think I looked at it earlier or around mid last year. So now there's been recent talks. Well, they have a summit coming up in next month, the 6th to the 7th of July. It will take place in, I think it's in Brazil this year, Rio, Brazil. And this term Rio Reset has been used by some quarters to talk about what they expect is going to take place in this summit regarding the financial institutions of the world, particularly these Bretton Woods institutions they're called. Bretton Woods is the hotel in the US where a conference was held, I think it was in 1944, and they created the IMF and the World Bank, and the forebearer to the World Trade Organization, I think it was the GATT, was created around the same time, but the IMF and the World Bank was created in that meeting. And the idea of the dollar, where they instituted the dollar as the global currency or reserve currency, where most trade, all trade around the world was supposed to take place using the US dollar. So the BRICS setup is something that some see as challenging this idea that Western institutions are the institutions that dominate world trade. Even the SWIFT system, this interbank transfer or communication system that is used for banks to make payments internationally between banks, is based in Europe. I think it's based in Switzerland or somewhere like that, or Brussels, one of those two places. So they want to challenge all those Western dominated organizations. Even though other countries have voting rights, the dominant voting rights go to the US and European countries, the US in particular. So the BRICS is seen as a challenge to that. But I'll be looking at what's going to be discussed in this coming summit and what the idea of the Rio Reset is. So-called reset, financial reset of the global order. So, in terms of this Rio Reset, what is the Rio Reset? This BRICS group is a financial institution, a financial marketing organization. I think some argue that they coined the term, but it was coined and they've written certain articles about this so-called Rio Reset. So he says the Rio Reset represents a critical juncture in international finance. After 10 plus years of financial economic engineering, he's convinced BRICS will make it history this summer. Which I doubt. I think, yes, they'll continue discussing the idea of moving away from the dollar and setting up their institution. Well, not just an idea, they actually are setting up institutions that have been set up since around 2014. And continuing the takeaways that are perceived to be taking place, that will take place within this summit. It's the culmination of a decade-long plan to bypass the dollar in their eyes. The BRICS is building another currency. Although there's been talk of a BRICS currency, but it seems they're not moving in that direction yet. Seeing it's a bit complicated for countries with such a diverse economy range to be able to set up a currency that all of them can align to. So they're setting up, what is they saying here is a new financial operating system. That's what they perceive there, but they are setting up, or they have set up new financial structures to challenge or move away from the Western banking system or the Western international banking, or Western loan system, I should say. He's saying the Rio Reset isn't a confrontation or a showdown. It's a quiet rejection of America's dominant role in the global financial system. It's a rejection, yes. They're moving away from something which they begin to see since 2008 as something that can be very unstable and affect the global international financial sector, because the financial crash in America and the Western world in 2008 gave the impression that their financial system is not so stable. So the rest of the world can't rely on their system. So one of the things that BRICS decided was to start working on setting up their own financial institutions, of which I'll mention in a minute. In terms of how the Americans see BRICS, they see it as a loss of economic dominance, so that this idea that they should dominate the global economy is being challenged by the BRICS. So they're worried about it. That's why Trump made certain remarks concerning the BRICS, which I'll mention later on, and the erosion of their purchasing power. A reduction in global dollar demand means all dollars lose value. Every dollar in your checking, savings, and retirement accounts will be devalued, purchasing less and less. So less use of the dollar internationally, less demand for the dollar, will cause the US economy to be affected in a negative way. So there's worry. Some aren't worried because they don't fully understand the economic system, but those who realize that it will affect the dollar negatively are those that are worried about what's coming. A viable threat to the US dollar's role as a global reserve currency. Nearly all international trade currently takes place in dollars, although that's declining. Without this crucial source of demand, the dollar's value could crater permanently. Heightened by geopolitical instability, BRICS nations will be empowered to pursue their own agendas without meaningful economic intervention from the US, a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, for example, or a new Russian crusade. These are false ideas that China intends to invade Taiwan, or that Russia intends to retake the territories that it lost after the fall of the USSR. So these are some of the worries that they have in the West about the decline of the dollar and how it will affect their power to control what takes place in the world. And in terms of the dollar itself, looking specifically at the dollar itself, this is something that President Trump said in February of this year. BRICS states were trying to destroy our dollar. They want to create a new currency. So when I came in, the first thing I said was any BRICS state that even mentions the destruction of the dollar will be charged a 150% tariff. And we don't want your goods. And the BRICS states just broke up. Well, they haven't broken up. They've continued to move forward with this idea of using local currencies more and more, and continue to develop the institutions which I'll mention later that they're actually creating or have created over the last few years, last 10 years or so. And again, in recent years, the term de-dollarization, or trade in non-dollar currencies instead of the US dollar, has begun to draw attention in discussions on international affairs. This has increased even more so after President Trump's threats to countries pursuing de-dollarization, as I mentioned. And this idea that Trump understands that the dollar dominance is a matter of national security. So it's seen in such a serious manner by him in particular. I don't know about what other presidents have been saying, but he's a president that's a bit more harsh than other presidents when it comes to particular issues. He's saying that if we lost the dollar as the world currency, I think that would be the equivalent of losing a war. That's what he said. He told the Economic Club of New York in September last year. So America in particular sees the de-dollarization of BRICS countries as something particularly serious. Anyway, let's move on to some of the structures that the BRICS is currently developing or has developed. So, BRICS Pay is an alternative international payment system for trade between nations, reliant on a decentralized cross-border messaging system. And there's the cross-border interbank payment system. I thought that's part of the BRICS Pay idea. Mbridge, a digital exchange to settle international trade imbalances using tokenized gold. So they want to bring gold back into the mix of global trade. And the two of the main institutions, the New Development Bank, I think that was set up in 2014. And it's an alternative to the World Bank, and it's giving out loans for development projects in many developing countries. It's not hasn't reached the level of the World Bank yet, but it has been giving out loans, although they have their internal wrangles, which is one of the reasons why the organization hasn't, or the bank hasn't grown as much as it should have by now. Then you have the alternative to the IMF, which I'll discuss fully in a minute. The contingency reserve arrangement basically gives money to countries to balance there's a difference between finance from trade exports and trade imports. That imbalance, and the IMF comes in to help countries to be able to access dollars so they can continue to either import and so forth. So it's basically a currency reserve to shelter BRICS nations against global liquidity pressures. And then also bilateral trade agreements. These are trade agreements between countries. And also currency exchange agreements, pacts made between central banks to provide liquidity and currency support in the financial emergencies. For example, here the People's Bank of China has these contracts in place with at least 40 other nations' central banks. Then you have central bank gold reserves, which I think Russia a few years ago and China began to accumulate their gold reserves because they knew that the time would come then. This fiat currency, which is a currency which is not backed by anything, particularly the dollar we're talking about here. But yeah, gold is coming back into the mix, and maybe I'll do a program about gold itself in the future and where it stands in terms of economic trade and balancing real wealth, which is not the same as the fiat currency wealth used in the West, in which they print money out of nothing. This idea of printing money out of nothing, where your paper is not backed by anything, has complicated the world's economy. Anyway, this BRICS contingency reserve arrangement is challenging the IMF in particular. It was established in 2014 and is a tool for providing liquidity, as I mentioned before. It reduces reliance on Western-centric financial institutions like the IMF. And although it hasn't really come fully into play yet from what I was reading a while ago, they're still structuralizing the CRA so it it can be used properly, and also the fact that its funds are a bit low. I'll go into the details, statistics of it, what it actually has and how much it can lend in a short while. The IMF's structural adjustment policies have been controversial in the Global South due to their punitive measures. The net CRA presents a potential alternative. The structural adjustment policies of the IMF meant that if it gave a loan to a country and that country struggled to repay the loan, the IMF would come in and look at the budget of a country and sit with the government of the country, ask them to make cuts in certain sectors such as education, health, and so forth in order to be able to repay the loan. And the CRA, this contingency reserve arrangement, doesn't have such limitations or such rules in which would restrict how a country can develop itself if you're asking a country to cut back on spending in certain sectors of its development in order to pay a loan. The CRA doesn't have that. And these are one of the things that, it's not just that, it's also issues around human rights and democracy and such things. These are the type of problems we had with IMF and Western lending organizations. They put stringent criteria. Imagine a country has to become more democratic, or it has to practice certain forms of human rights before it can get a loan from a Western bank. But the BRICS banks that they're setting up won't have such problems aligned to them. By expanding and reforming the TRA, it could support development and economic growth in a way that the IMF's rescue packages with their growth-stifling policies have not. The CRA's reserve pool could expand significantly, because at the moment it's around 100 billion in total, each of the 5 BRICS countries. had allocated a certain amount of money to this bank or this fund. But with the other 6 countries that have joined, I'd have to investigate and find out how much it would expand to. Because Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, for example, have also joined, so that would expand this $100 billion pool. A large capital base would boost the CRA's credibility and effectiveness in preventing currency crisis among its members. Secondly, originally the CRA was heavily reliant on the US dollar, with 70% of its funds accessible solely through IMF-linked conditionalities. So even though when its CRA is first set up, it seems it was somehow linked to the IMF still. But I think what they want to do is remove that link so it can operate fully autonomously from the IMF. To establish true financial sovereignty, the expanded BRICS alliance must prioritize increasing the proportion of local currencies used in CRA transactions. And given the economic disparities among BRICS nations, restructuring the CRA's governance is essential. This restructuring should reflect the varying contributions, capacities, and financial needs of new members. And they give an example here. For instance, stronger economies like China and Saudi Arabia should assume greater lender responsibilities, while countries like Ethiopia and South Africa, with greater needs, should have increased access to emergency. So the countries with greater economies obviously should lend more within this CRA arrangement. And the poorer countries should have more access to loans so they can balance their economies. And continuing with the CRA, it reduces reliance on Western-centric financial institutions like the IMF, as they've said. And these are 2 of the countries, or 3 of the countries. In addition, Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, and UAE. Indonesia is also there. CRA is emerging as a crucial tool for financial sovereignty. So it seems how this IMF works, or in the CRA, is that all the countries that are part of its structure give a certain amount of money that can be lent to other countries. So the poorer countries won't have much to lend, but the larger countries, for example, like the United States, China, all those countries would be lending within the IMF, but according to their rules and regulations of what a country must do before it can get a loan. But the CRA doesn't have those rules and regulations. That's the same as the IMF. So when it gives out a loan, there are no conditions that countries have to meet, or less conditions, or less stringent conditions that countries have to meet before they can get a loan. So that's one of the advantages of this CRA. The initial 5 BRICS members created the CRA with $100 billion to address short-term balance of payments issues. With the recent expansion, as I was saying, its capacity should expand. And then you have, apart from the 11 BRICS members, you also have partner countries, which also are about something like 5 or more when they join, because BRICS is continuing to expand almost every year. So even in July, this coming July, I don't know if there are going to be any new members. The CRA has enormous potential, but it has obstacles to become a true rival to the Western financial dominance. The decision-making within CRA could be hindered by differing political or geopolitical priorities. But then again, within the IMF, there are many countries with different geopolitical priorities. But seen as the CRA is a younger organization, I think it still has its issues as a young organization in terms of its members and the type of decisions that they're going to agree on. So that's a look at the CRA, this contingency reserve arrangement. I'm going to look at some statistics now regarding BRICS. BRICS itself has about half the world's population, half of the global industrial capacity, and the majority of global resources in terms of oil and natural gas reserves. So if they organize themselves properly, they can remove this dominance influence that Western countries have. I think that's one of the issues within BRICS. Some countries just want to increase trade. Others want to get more involved politically in world affairs so that they can take some of this dominant power away from the Western countries, particularly America, in terms of control of resources and demanding our countries operate. The IMF data also shows that the 11 member countries of the groupings are becoming more important in the world economy than the so-called G7. In terms of their share of the global economy, the developed countries accounted for approximately 28% last year. And this year's projection, while the BRICS account for 40%, so the BRICS accounts for 40% of the global economy right now. And it's saying here the difference in GDP is even greater. The G7 has an average of 1.7% in 2024, and a projection of 1.2% this year, while the BRICS had an average of 4% last year and 3.4% expected this year. So the BRICS grouping has a larger percentage of the global GDP than the so-called G7. So as a bloc, it is growing, but so far you don't really hear that much about its economic influence. If you look, for example, at this US president and his tariffs on almost all countries in the world, particularly China, you get the impression that America's of some strong power that if it puts tariffs on all countries in the world, it's going to have a great impact. But the reality is economic power in the world is much lower than people realize. According to recent reports, over 65% of trade among BRICS nations is now denominated in own currencies, and this will increase. So Trump's threat to countries that if they move away from the dollar, they're going to punish them somehow, is not much of a threat really, because countries are going to do it anyway, and there's not much the US can do to stop it. Even though countries like India are saying that they don't really want to move away from the dollar, the BRICS to them is just an alternative structure that they can use. It's not something that they want to use as a tool to turn against the West, basically. They don't want to use it as a tool to fight against the West economically. But I think it will end up being something seen as that if trade between BRICS countries decreases more and many more global South countries join the BRICS organization, there will definitely be a decline in the use of the dollar, one that will cause significant damage to the US economy. So finally, looking at some of the things are said by Chinese and Russian officials regarding the BRICS and the global economy. So one Chinese official is saying that this is a financial emancipation and the first step towards insulating our economies from the arbitrary Western diktats. So they see the ways that the West as dictating how other countries should behave, but to move financially away from them will weaken this ability of the West to dictate what other countries can do. Moscow wasted no time in hailing the rollout. Russian Finance Minister Antov Siluanov declared the world is changing. Financial institutions must serve sovereign nations, not the geopolitical ambitions of a single bloc. That is the Western bloc. So, comments from Russia and China there. The world is changing. I think not only since the financial crash of 2008, but all along, countries have been seeing that the US has been bullying countries and preventing countries from developing properly because of the type of loan structure that they have. That's why, for example, many African countries prefer to borrow loans, take loans out from China than the US. Although China is not perfect, it doesn't attach certain conditionalities to its loans the way the US does, demanding that countries change their political system or the social system before they can take out any type of, before they can give them a loan. But the BRICS, in a similar manner, doesn't have the same type of conditionalities. But we'll see how the BRICS develops. At the moment, people look at BRICS and see it mainly relating to finance, but it's also talking about trying to coerce or create change within the United Nations, particularly the United Nations Security Council and its voting system, and how one country can veto a decision that can affect people. For example, what's happening in West Asia, and not only there, but it's not only America that uses these veto power. I've seen from reading about which countries have used it. Countries can use it to suit their own agendas, basically. So if they're at war with a country and a Security Council resolution is being discussed to either cause them to stop the war or something they don't agree with, they can just veto it. And there's nothing that the Security Council can do. There should be situations where a veto power cannot be used. But anyway, let's look at the BRICS system and the way the world is changing. I think after the coming summit in July, I'll have to do a program to look at the decisions or what came out of the summit, basically. Because I see what for example, this talk of a BRICS currency, which they've been talking about, but they're also saying they're not ready to implement a BRICS currency yet. Maybe there'll be some changes after the summit, but I doubt. But we'll also find out how far these institutions have developed in the last few years, because the New Development Bank and the CRA have been in existence 10 years. And one has been giving out a number of loans, but they're still relatively small compared to the IMF and the World Bank. Yeah, we'll see what happens with that. Anyway, that's it for now.